Lev Tolstoy.
My subject in this lecture is one of the most remarkable men in modern Russian life, a man who was both idolized as a saint, even a prophet, but also reviled as a false prophet, even as a threat to the Orthodox Christianity that was the basis of Russia's nationhood. A man who was equally a great literary figure. Indeed, many would say he shaped the modern world novel itself, and also a man known as a great voice in Russia's public life. Indeed, many would say Russia's conscience at the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. Indeed, a man whose ideas had influence well beyond Russia itself. And this is, of course, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, also known as Leo Tolstoy, who lived from 1828 to 1910. Now, as you know, Russians have traditionally believed that writers should do more than just entertain. A writer must, by definition, speak the truth, stand up as a moral witness, a witness to good and evil in the world. This was the point, of course, you'll recall, of Belinsky's famous advice to Gogol, where he said one can forgive a bad book, that is aesthetically bad, but never a pernicious book, one that is morally bad, that is bad in the ideas that it conveys. But even in this tradition of being a witness as a writer, a moral spokesman for truth, even in this tradition, Tolstoy was in many ways unique within Russia. No other Russian writer generated a civic movement that took his name. There have been no Pushkinians, there were no Gogolians, there were no Dostoevskians in terms of people taking their ideas as part of a movement. But there were, and in fact still are, Tolstoyans. Though it's worth noting that Tolstoy himself used to say, "I am Tolstoy, but I'm not a Tolstoyan." Now, Tolstoy's life helped encourage these images of him and devotion to him as a great moral figure, even a sort of national prophet. In fact, in interesting ways, Tolstoy's life can be seen as echoing the traditional Russian ideal of a saint, perhaps deliberately on his part, but certainly in the eyes of many Russians. If you read the hagiographies, the official lives of the saints that were most loved in Russian culture, such as Saint Nicholas, or the Russian saints, Saint Sergius of Radonezh or Saint Seraphim of Sarov, certain characteristics stand out in their stories. They all were generally wealthier people who gave up their wealth and secular power. In other words, people who turned away from the secular world, the material world. They were known for their closeness to nature, to the natural world. They were known for their compassion and pity for others, especially for the suffering in the world. These are the characteristics that make the most popular Russian saints. And in many ways, Tolstoy's life, especially in his later years, exemplified these ideals, partly intentionally on his part, certainly in the eyes of so many people around him, all of which aided the particular importance he had in Russian culture. Now, if you look at Tolstoy's life, at least superficially, it seems to have three major and quite distinct periods. The first one is a youth filled with privilege and typical aristocratic dissipation. He was born, as I mentioned, in 1828. This was August 28th on the Russian calendar, but 12 days later on the European calendar, so September 9th. He was born into a family of hereditary landed aristocrats with an ancient lineage and lots of wealth and land. In fact, in Russia's estate structure, he stood above the average nobleman, hence his title of Count Tolstoy. And his early life was fairly typical of his aristocratic class in the middle part of the 19th century. He was educated at home at the family estate known as Yasnaya Polyana, which meant bright, clear fields. It's a lovely place in the south of Moscow. He was sent after a good home education with tutors to Kazan University, where he studied for 3 years in the 1840s, but dropped out in 1847 before ever graduating and returning to his estates. Much of his time during the next few years, as it was partly in college as well, was spent in a completely dissipated life in Moscow and Petersburg, the place where, of course, the nobility tended to gather and play. Drinking, dancing, affairs with various women, and a great deal of gambling, characteristic of his class. Then in 1851, thinking something else to do, he was beginning to bore of all this, he decided, as also was characteristic of many upper-class Russians in the 19th century, to join the army, where his brother already was an officer. He became an officer fairly quickly, 1854, and fought in the Crimean War. In fact, it's clear that he really loved being an officer. He didn't like so much the battles themselves. In fact, he found them quite disturbing, but he liked the status and the uniform and the glory of being an officer. Now, while there, he began to write his first fiction, and he naturally picked first his experiences as a soldier. First, stories began to appear about his time in the Caucasus, in the mountains of southern Russia, where he recalled fighting against various tribal groups. And most famously, a series of stories began to appear about the war in the Crimean Peninsula, especially the siege of Sevastopol. These writings were actually very well received. In particular, people admired the way he described the heroism of ordinary soldiers, but also they found sympathetic his descriptions of the horrors of battle. And he decided he'd actually pursue this career as a writer. So in 1856, he resigned from the army, he resigned his commission as an officer, and returned to his estate to write. And this begins the second period of his life, that of Tolstoy, the great novelist. The whole world, of course, knows about his major works of these years, his autobiographical trilogy, Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, from the 1850s, his great epic of individuals and families during the Napoleonic Wars, War and Peace. His story, his novel, Anna Karenina, a tragic story about two marriages and the search for love and happiness that he wrote in the mid-1870s, and other lesser works, but still significant ones. Then comes the third period of his life, the most difficult in some ways to understand, which seemed so totally different from the first two. Around 1878, just after he finished Anna Karenina, he passed through a very deep religious crisis that resulted in what he described as his conversion to a truer Christianity. I'll say more about the content of this Christianity later. What I want to emphasize is the shape of this moment. He devoted his life at this point to propagating in dozens of pamphlets. He really gave up writing great epic novels at this point, propagating his religious views, and also a social ethics that was very tied up with these religious thoughts, an ethics of the simple life and nonviolence. At the same time, he tried to exemplify his new ideals in his own everyday life. Above all, he tried to live a really simple life, which he defined as a virtuous life, a life that was in touch with nature and with physical labor. So in the 1880s, he began to wear only peasant dress, no longer the dress of an aristocrat, and it was partly because he liked to say he believed that peasants were closer to nature, were more virtuous. He worked part of his own lands with his own hands. He took up physical crafts such as shoemaking, and he tried within his own house to do all his own chores, cleaning the house, washing his own clothes, emptying the chamber pot, and the like. He also refused to eat any killed animals, declaring moral compassion for life wouldn't allow him, and he became a vegetarian. He even abstained from sexual life, declaring this to be quite sinful, to the, by the way, considerable dismay of his wife, who didn't share any of these particular ideals. He even decided, to the even greater dismay of his wife, to give all his property away to the poor, and only after considerable protests by his wife and family did he agree to give it to them instead. His main concern was that he wouldn't have any property anymore. During the final years of his life, he was constantly thinking of doing more. This didn't seem enough to him. It didn't seem to achieve the goals that he was seeking. And he decided perhaps he should give everything up and become a hermit, live in a cave, live in a small hut in the woods, perhaps become a pilgrim and go from site to site in Russia. And in fact, with this aim in mind, as quite an old man, in 1910, he simply fled his estate, left his family, his wife, the world as a whole. But before he could find a place to live as a hermit, he fell quite ill. And while at a train station that was then known as Ostapova, a minor train station, now is of course known as the Tolstoy train station, he lay there for 10 days in the humble rooms of the station master, slowly dying. Already very famous at this point, the whole world began to hear about this story, and followers and admirers and journalists, including from other countries, began to gather in greater and greater numbers at this tiny little train station outside Moscow. Hourly bulletins were dispatched declaring what the state of his health was, and these were published in newspapers all around the world, and of course in Russia. And finally, on November 7th, 1910, he died, leading many people to declare him to be a martyr and even a saint. Now, the problem with this story about the externals of Tolstoy's life is it, in many ways, I think, though true, exaggerates the breaks in his life. In particular, it exaggerates how sudden this conversion to a new way of thinking was in this so-called third period of his life, this conversion to a new religion and to a philosophy of simplicity. And the deeper story is, in fact, I think, more complicated, more interesting, and also more entwined with the ideas of his time. To see this, I think it's useful to revisit his earlier life, and of course, his writings, which are his clearest expression. In fact, it turns out that from very early in Tolstoy's life, we see that he was preoccupied with self-perfection, as we know so many educated Russians were at the time. The search for truth, for virtue, became extremely important to him, even in his late teens and early 20s. Consider, for example, this entry from his own diary. This is in the mid-1840s. He's in his early 20s, and he writes as follows. Ivanov arrived. I talked too long with him. Cowardice. I didn't go to Bleklemishev's house. Feebleness of energy. At gymnastics, I failed to walk the bars. Cowardice. I didn't do a single trick because it hurts. Softness. At Gorchakov's, I enjoyed lies. At home, I didn't study English. Lack of resolution. I got up late. Sloth. With Begachev and Islavin, I was vain. On Tverskoy Boulevard, the sort of main drag in Moscow, on Tverskoy Boulevard, I wanted to show off. And it goes on and on and on like this, as did so many entries. His diaries are also filled with enormous lists of rules, how he should be firmer, how he should work harder, how he should study better, how he shouldn't gamble as much, how he should drink less, how he should be nicer to people. And he kept breaking these rules and writing more and more lists, obsessed with a type of self-perfection, even as a young man. Most importantly, Tolstoy's search for self-understanding, moral perfection can be seen in his stories and novels. For example, in his very first literary work, the trilogy Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, he takes the conventional structure of reminiscences of childhood. It's a popular thing that existed in other countries as well. But he uses it above all to explore what had already become from his diaries his favorite theme, himself. Psychological self-analysis of his own developing consciousness. These themes of self-examination and self-perfection are even more evident in Tolstoy's major work of his middle period, the great epic novel War and Peace, the first draft of which was completed in 1869. This book, of course, is massive, not only in pages, but in construction and conception. And many critics, in fact, including Tolstoy himself, have suggested that it's not actually a single novel in any conventional sense at all. In fact, several have argued that it's really several novels, or as literary scholars would say, novelistic genres woven together in some enormous but connected structure. And one of the genres that one finds here in War and Peace is what the Germans called at the time a Bildungsroman, a novel about a moral and psychological journey of a person to try to discover themselves and truth about the world. And in fact, this is exactly what a good part of this novel concerns. And in fact, several characters in War and Peace take this journey of Bildung, this journey of self-knowledge and discovery and enlightenment. And among these, the most important, for the most autobiographical character in War and Peace, is a man named, and his name is telling, Pierre Bezukhov. It's a wonderful name. Pierre, he's a Russian, but he has a French first name, a sense of the uprootedness and foreignness and excessive Frenchification of this character. But his last name, Bezukhov, means a man without ears, a man who cannot hear. Who cannot hear what? You can ask, perhaps, truth and about the world. And Bezukhov's journey of moral and spiritual growth takes him through a number of interesting stages, alternating, of course, with periods of absolute despair and uncertainty. He begins with a stage of sensuality and physical self-indulgence. One recognizes the autobiographical story here to some extent. He's led to greater searching for the meaning of life. He becomes a Freemason. He becomes involved in philanthropy. That leads him eventually to greater and greater mysticism. One could see this as the course followed by many intellectuals, especially in the era of the Napoleonic War, indeed in some ways by Pushkin and the Decembrists, and even to a certain extent Alexander I himself. But finally, this journey leads him beyond all these stages, and it leads him to a truth embodied in a peasant. This is typical Tolstoy, in a peasant whose name is Platon Karatayev, a man who Bezukhov shares a cell in Moscow in 1812 after they're both picked up wandering the streets of the burning city occupied by the French. Platon Karatayev, and by the way, his name, Platon, is the Russian word for the great philosopher Plato. This is obviously intentional. Platon Karatayev, this Russian Plato of the peasantry, is a natural man of the people, as he's portrayed. He exemplifies all the great principles of life, all the virtues that Tolstoy would embrace later in the 1880s and after. Simplicity, honesty, being in touch with community, and a sense of community and even nation much more than simply individuality. And above all, a natural occupation. Here was a man who could hear the world, the natural world, who worked close to nature, and who wasn't alien in the way that Bezukhov was. In fact, as Bezukhov, really Tolstoy, puts it in the novel, here was, in Karatayev, the personification of everything good, Russian, and strong. In the end, however, and this is telling and perhaps prophetic about Tolstoy and so many of his generation, Bezukhov still remains, even after this journey of discovery, uncertain and lost. He's not totally sure by the end of the novel that he really has found the truth. He appears to, but he doubts. He continues to doubt. And in fact, interestingly, the only character in War and Peace whose search for the truth ends in certainty that he has found the truth about the world is a character named Andrei Bolkonsky, highly aristocratic, highly intellectual, highly sensitive individual engaged in a typical searching for the meaning of life. He finds truth, and this is telling, only when he lay on the battlefields of Austerlitz, dying, looking up at the sky. At this point, he experiences a blissful epiphany that seems to give to him the meaning of life, though, in fact, Tolstoy doesn't ever really tell us what he's discovered, except he's now dead. Now, as I've already mentioned, one of the major themes in Tolstoy's worldview, and again, from very early on, is the idealization of simplicity. He felt quite certain throughout his life that human beings were essentially born innocent, but they were gradually ruined by the institutions of civilization, especially Western European style education that was so pervasive in Russia. The trouble with education, he said, is it was practiced everywhere in Russia, and this is before, remember, his great religious and moral conversion of the 1880s. He argued quite early that this education ruined people's natures. It blinded them to the deepest truths by all these layers of civilization. And these truths can be seen best by people who have not been corrupted, especially children, and, as he would later show in War and Peace, peasants. And you can see, of course, echoes of Slavophile arguments in all of this, especially regarding peasants. Already in the 1850s and 1860s, Tolstoy began to try to put into practice these ideas by engaging in various educational efforts on his own noble estate. He established a school for peasants, peasant boys, that is, in which he followed what was really for Russia at the time a very unusual educational method. And he wrote a great deal about it in order that people throughout Russia should hear about these things. He said, of course, one needs to teach the basic school skills in school, reading and geography and arithmetic and zoology and physics and the like. But very importantly, he argued, and tried to practice this in his schools, one has to teach without crushing the will to learn, the love of knowledge, the natural intelligence, he liked to call it, of children, their harmoniousness with nature, their harmonious relations with other people, their natural morality even. And he elaborated this into a set of ideas even more generally, and this is in his earlier period of life. People, he argued, are basically evil in the world, and above all, miserable, not because they're ignorant, but because they're too civilized. Again, you hear the echoes of the Slavophiles. They've lost touch with natural reason and truth. And these truths, of course, include such things as justice and freedom and equality and human dignity and love, which he argued grow out of the very nature of people. They naturally crave these things, and then the more civilized they become, they begin to forget about these basic fundamental truths and hence become evil or miserable or both. And one can find these sorts of ideas in all of Tolstoy's works, including, again, as I'm emphasizing, even before his famous conversion. For example, in a novel he wrote in 1862 called The Cossacks, one meets these two Cossacks, one of them named Lukashka and the other named Uncle Yeroshka. And it's clear that these characters are morally superior and a whole lot happier than educated noblemen who they meet in the course of the novel. In fact, one of these noblemen, an officer named Alyenin, realizes how unhappy he is and how happy the Cossacks are, precisely because of their simplicity. And similarly, we find in War and Peace, Pierre, and in Anna Karenina, a character named Konstantin Levin, both aristocrats, recognize the greater happiness, the greater morality, the greater harmony with the world of simple peasants and simple soldiers. Now, of course, after Tolstoy's conversion, all of these ideas about natural human values best recognized by children and peasants pervade all the pamphlets that he wrote and his late novels such as Resurrection, which he worked on throughout the 90s. But clearly, this moment of transformation was part of his whole life and, of course, connected to other ideas being discussed by other people in Russian life at the time. Another theme in his writing, worth emphasizing, and again characteristic of some people's thought at the time, is an increasing distaste for individualism. His talk about the need for self-renunciation. In fact, in different ways, most of Tolstoy's great novels make a case against the autonomous individual. Most famously, of course, in War and Peace, Tolstoy tries to argue that individuals in history, great men like Napoleon, are in fact powerless to affect the way history happens, to affect the movement of history. And of course, the way this is set up and shown in the novel is that the greatness of the Russian commander, Mikhail Kutuzov, isn't because he challenges history, but because he understands the natural flow of events, and he works in harmony with them, rather than trying to manipulate history. Similar in the great novel Anna Karenina, we see a deep struggle within the main character, Anna, an ultimately tragic struggle, in which her individual self, which strives for freedom and happiness, personal happiness, self-expression through love, is in constant conflict with her social self, her social morality, and her need to be part of a natural community, in particular, to be a wife, to be a mother. And in fact, when she loses her last bonds to other people, to her husband, to her son, even to her lover, seen as the source of her new happiness, she's left with nothing, Tolstoy says, but her individuality, and she commits suicide. And she does so, of course, for added emphasis, under the wheels of a train at a crowded train station, the very symbol of what modern life is all about in some ways. By contrast, of course, in this novel, in Anna Karenina, Konstantin Levin, another character, finds happiness by giving up all his plans for individual personal happiness and finding real happiness in marriage and friendship and, of course, closeness to nature. Now, all of these concerns and ideas, and many others, led Tolstoy to think in new ways about religion. So new, in fact, that the Russian Orthodox Church excommunicated him in 1901. And for Tolstoy, official Christianity was deeply flawed. And the problem was that it masked and crushed and perverted and hid all the true meanings of life, the universal truths that come out of people's lives naturally and are at the heart of true Christianity, he said, and in fact of all religions. Thus, he argued, the real soul and heart of Christianity and the real greatness of Jesus Christ, who he argued was not a divine figure, but a man of genius, a great prophet, was that he could see through the falsehoods of civilization even in his time. And Tolstoy argued that what Jesus taught was not mystical, it wasn't mysterious, despite all the myths, he said, the church had built up around Jesus' life, but it was simple and understandable by all. And the church tried to hide these simple truths because, as Tolstoy argued, they were dangerous truths for any established power to hide them behind ritual and dogma. For Tolstoy, the whole of Christianity and of his new religious perspective was expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, which Tolstoy summed up in a wonderful phrase in his essay, What I Believe, which he wrote in 1882 to let people know these ideas. He said, the essence of Christianity is nothing less than, his words, Christ enjoins men to refrain from stupid actions. In other words, from acts that their nature tells them are wrong. Anger or hatred or violence or murder. And inspired by this ethical reading of Christianity, Tolstoy goes on to reject just about everything the established Orthodox Church held sacred. He rejected theological dogma, the Holy Trinity, Immaculate Conception, virgin birth, Christ's divinity, resurrection was all a myth to hide the fundamental ethical truth that he and many others at his time were saying is at the heart of Christianity. He also rejected the need for priests and sacraments and liturgy. For Tolstoy, the only sacrament needed was the practice of universal ideals of moral good, which are natural to people once they rediscover them. In fact, toward the end of his life, Tolstoy decided to advance these ideas by actually rewriting the Gospels to create one single narrative instead of the confusion of four that would be without anything mystical or supernatural. He felt like he had become virtually a witness himself of the moment of crucifixion and the story of Jesus, and therefore should write his own Tolstoyan gospel. Now, I want to conclude by recalling Tolstoy's comment when he says, I'm Tolstoy, I'm not a Tolstoyan. Because this, in a way, is a way of suggesting that he did in many ways remain a person, a man, and as such, filled with contradictions and doubt. As I've suggested, one can see in some of his closest characters in his novels, like Pierre Bezukhov. His arguments, when you take them as a whole, were often contradictory. He famously argued for quietism, for non-resistance to evil, for Christ's principle of turning the other cheek. But he also insisted that evil has to be publicly criticized as often as possible. He combined a belief in learning from common people with a conviction that they needed to be taught to see the light of truth, hence writing so many pamphlets, planning to rewrite the Gospels themselves. People needed to be persuaded. He combined a belief in absolute truths, which were natural to human beings, an idea we've seen others articulating at the time, with a conviction that their verity could never be demonstrated, that only faith ultimately brought absolute certainty. And yet, as he often argued, faith without questioning was blind faith and potentially a lie. Ultimately, in other words, he never stopped asking questions, struggling to find certainty, like so many of his literary characters, in fact. And in the end, these uncertainties led him on his final tragic journey, his decision to abandon everything and wander the country as a poor pilgrim. One interpreter of Tolstoy's life, Sir Isaiah Berlin, great intellectual historian of Russia, described this dramatic and fateful moment starkly. In his words, Tolstoy sacrificed all he had upon her altar, the altar of truth. Happiness, friendship, love, peace, moral and intellectual certainty, and in the end, life itself. And all truth gave him in return was doubt, insecurity, self-contempt, and insoluble contradictions. Perhaps in a way, this uncertainty and contradiction is really at the heart of Tolstoy's genius, and in many ways, his centrality as a man of his age, the late 19th and early 20th century of Russia. He probed much more deeply than most in searching for answers. But he was always too much of a genius to ever be certain that he found them. No less importantly, in this uncertainty, he was in many ways, perhaps tragically, characteristic of his time. Next time, I'm going to return to the state and its rulers, and to a man who seemed stubbornly certain that he did know the truth about life and the world. This was the Emperor Alexander III.